So yeah, one of the issues too is that plants can take up a lot of polygons, right? So I'm going to show you ways in which we can essentially use mesh to sort of be efficient and mass-produced quite easily inside of Maya using two sets of software basically within it, which is Arnold, the render engine, and something called Mash. Basically, it creates these kind of very dynamic networks, and actually, it sort of stores a cached version of your objects so that you can replicate them really, really quickly. And it makes your scene really fast and efficient to render, especially when you've got potentially tens of millions, hundreds of millions of polys of trees and grass and things like that. It sort of renders one as if it's thousands, as if it's only one. So what I'm going to do first, I just have some preloaded objects here, and again, I'll talk about later how to maybe make your own grass or get grass from existing libraries inside of Maya. This one was a free object set and texture set, and I basically converted all the materials here to, here, let's just, usually I like to label things very directly. So this texture is going to be called plants_txt for texture. So I had to relink the materials, so I basically converted them from a standard, I think, Fung or Blinn to an AI standard, and I basically relinked the color maps and the alpha channel. For some reason, Arnold, at least in 2024, does not display the alpha channel, but if you were to just simply render this, you can see that it is loaded correctly, so we can see through the leaves and things of that nature, right? So this is very simple, stylized textures. The poly count is quite low. I think 17,000, I mean, is still somewhat high on a low poly plant, but a single tree could be in the tens or hundreds of thousands of polys. So the way Mash works is basically you have, I'll just hide these. So I might want just 4 different trees. Let me just see here. Yeah, I'll just hide these for now. So I'll hit H to hide. So I'll show you the basics of Mash, and then we'll get into how to use this on an environment. So I'll create a sphere to start, very simple sphere. And if you simply go over, typically you have Mash already enabled, and there's a shelf for that. And if you click on this little kind of cube with an upside down M on it, that will create a network or distribution of objects, okay? So in the distribution node, you have different distribution types, such as radial, such as spherical, and you can crank these numbers up. And we can also go beyond. Like the slider stops at 100, but we can set this up to like 100,000 if you want, or 10,000, right? Then we get something like this, yeah? Now, it does get quite slow. As you can see, it's quite heavy with a few thousand copies of just a basic sphere. So what I recommend is that we use a different variation on this. So I usually will switch over to my effects. By the way, sometimes this happens, Mash may not be enabled. You can go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and type in Mash at the top, and you just want to make sure that is checked to be loaded and auto-loaded. Anyways, I'll go to the Mash menu here and click on Create Mash Network, but this time I want to do something very, very simple, and I generally prefer this to be the default, so I'm going to save the settings. I want this to be set to instancer. So like I said, what instancer does, instead of actually making each copy like a copy-paste, it still links to the original mesh. And so now if I were to go to, let's say, spherical and crank up the numbers here, right, it's nowhere near as slow. I'm actually able to work much, much faster. Let's say I go to 10,000, right? I have no lag basically on the viewport. So instancer is almost like intelligently reproducing this in a way that is much, much more efficient for the machine, okay? So I'll simply undo this. So I will create, like I said, I'll create a very basic ground plane for now. So I'll just make sure the scale is large enough for a scene. And I'll just give it a little bit of variety here. So I'm going to hit, select some vertices, hold B, left click and drag so I can get a nice kind of soft selection here. Just make sure, am I on? Oh yeah, edge constraint is on, so I'll turn that off. There we go. So I'll give this thing maybe a little hill, maybe a little valley thing over here. Okay, I'll just hide that for now. So You can either, like I said, start with one object selected, and if you're making your own object, I generally recommend that the pivot be right at the very bottom. Or if you want it to embed in the ground a bit, you can move it up a little bit. That can help too. But generally centered where the thing should make contact with the ground. Okay. So again, I'll go back to Mesh, create Mesh Network, and say Apply. Now it's going to jump to the middle here. And let me go back under the attribute editor, and again, I'll crank up the copies. Right now it's on linear, and it's sort of set to be spaced. I just want one copy to start, and then I don't want any offset distance here, so I'll set the X distance to 0. There is an option here to go to Mesh. So if I click on Mesh, it's going to ask, hey, do you want to load a mesh? And there's a little line here at what's called an input mesh. So I should rename my ground plane here. I'll just call it ground, and I'll select my mesh network, and then I'm going to middle mouse click and drag the ground plane into here, and now this thing aligns or snaps and aligns to there. So what's great about this is I can crank the numbers very quickly, right? Pretty cool, yeah? So what I'll do is I'll turn on Arnold for a second here. Turn on the IPR. Oops, I forgot I hid my my sky dome, so it's just coming up black. So let's try that one more time. There we go. Okay, pretty good. Right, what's great about this is it's like fully interactive. Right, this could represent 1,000,000 polys, right, based on a number. And watch this. If I go back into Mesh, click on the network, and let's say I set it to like 10,000. You know, I can basically almost have like a field that looks like grass, but it's actually trees, right? Now you hear my computer spinning up. It is going to take a bit more energy because it is calculating a lot of shadows. But the point is, this is still very fast, efficient, and interactive, right? Okay, let's set it back down to a more reasonable number. Let's say 150. So let's say if this were just grass, I will switch to the grass later on, but I'll show you a few different ways to kind of scatter objects across a surface. We can do this thing called up vector. So what that means is that instead of the trees kind of fully aligning to the surface itself, it'll try to align to itself. Something else I often will do is go into, if you go into the main Mesh tab under the attribute editor, there is something called random. So if I click on add random node, usually I don't want random position, at least for the trees, but I do want random rotation. And if I hit, usually Y is the up-down axis, meaning that you're kind of spinning in place, but in this case you see them kind of tilting off. So again, I want to make sure I'm using the transform space of the local tree, right? So then they're not all lined up the same way, they're kind of randomly facing their own direction. And then random scale is also useful, and I typically don't like distortion because it makes the textures look stretched, so I'll say uniform scale. Okay, so let me go back to the Mesh distribute and maybe drop the number again, just because I'm getting a variety of sizes and it's kind of filling up the environment pretty quickly, right? So this is a very, very fast way to set up and create an environment. There's one additional thing we can do, which is kind of interesting, and you can do this at the beginning. So I could have selected all the trees as my set in the beginning, and when I went to create the Mesh instancer, but you can also go back and click on the instancer, and I can take the additional trees that I don't have in here. So usually it's a bit awkward, but you have to click on, control click on these additional trees, and then you click, control click on the instancer, and if you middle mouse click and drag these over, or click add to the selection, this will add this in, and it should, in theory, oh, it hasn't changed the trees yet because you do have to go into Mesh. Basically what happens is each object added, if you take a look at the instancer, it has these numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are basically called object IDs, and so if you click on this and add ID node, now you can get, right, organic randomization, right, which looks very nice, very believable, and more realistic, right? So I often recommend if you have one type and you're going to tweak the colors of an object, let's say you make one stylized tree, it could be one mesh that you recolor 3-4 times or shift the hues and colors on. Usually I recommend at least 3 different mesh types. So if you have a tree of one type but you want variety, make 3 different types with enough dimensionality that it looks different from angles. So 3 is a base, and then if you can have 3 different color shifted or color tweaked versions of textures, okay? So this way, yeah, we can get in and have a fairly lush looking environment. And again, let me just go back to Mesh, distribute, because this is kind of what controls our count. And let's say I drop it or drive it up to 200, right? Now we got this like fairly nice looking forest. And if you feel like the scale isn't right, sometimes I'll take the plane and scale it. So I'll just scale this, and you'll see that, you know, now the trees look more in proportion maybe with the object. Just scale it right. So you can have something that maybe looks in proportion, or you can select the original objects and scale them. So you can still go back to the original source objects, and if you tweak those, they will carry through the updates in the instancer. Okay. And again, if we want more lush forest, you know, it's going to hurt my computer for rendering a bit, but there you go. Pretty cool.